Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Maine Forest Service's WoodsWise lunch hour. My name is Andy Shultz. I'm the landowner outreach forester for the Maine Forest Service. This is our third WoodsWise lunch hour. Hopefully, we won't run into too many technical problems, but if we do, please bear with us. We're continuing to learn as we go. Hope you all had a relatively easy time of signing on. Do want to put out a few ground rules, as I mentioned to the folks who signed up or signed on early. Please mute your audio and turn off your videos so that we don't get feedback or overload the network. When you do have a question or comment, you can use the raise hand button, which is in the floating bar, which should be towards the bottom of your screen or somewhere. I've found that the buttons can be lots of different places, but there should be a raise hand button. There's also a chat function where you can type in a question or comment, and we welcome that during the presentation. When we do get to the Q&A or call on somebody, you can obviously turn on your microphone and your camera at that time. That would be fine. We're looking at probably a 30 to 40-minute presentation. We'll follow that with the questions that come up during the presentation. We did have some questions sent in ahead of time that we'll address as well. We would like this to be as interactive as possible without things getting too confusing. So, as I said, bear with us. We hope things will go pretty smoothly. And with that, I would introduce to you Morten Moesswilde, who is the field team leader for Maine Forest Service, and he can take it from there.
Great. Well, thanks, Andy, and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about planning for a successful timber harvest. And so I've got about 30 slides. I just want you to be aware, and I'm going to share my screen here. I just want you to be aware that this is a much condensed version of a series of presentations that could all be considerably more involved, more in depth. So we'll go from there. So I just want to check in and make sure that everybody can see that. Okay, does that look all right? I hope so.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So again, welcome and thanks for joining us. The emphasis here really is on the word planning. We are talking about timber harvesting, but timber harvests are complex events that have a lot of moving parts, literally, and planning ahead is really key. So we're going to try to cover some of the primary elements of planning and some of the components. Each of these, as I said before, really could involve a presentation all unto themselves. So just from the outset, I just want to make sure that people know that Maine Forest Service Forest Policy and Management Division has 10 district foresters around the state, and one of our big roles is to provide assistance to landowners, also to foresters, loggers, anybody who is involved with all kinds of different forestry activities, including timber harvesting, to try to provide information, get people answers, suggestions, thoughts from one of us ahead of time. We do meet with landowners and others in the field at no charge to try to provide answers to whatever questions people will have. We have some other roles. We do provide a lot of education and outreach, such as this presentation, and some other functions as well. So feel free to contact us if you need assistance with any of this stuff. Just a side note, we are not forest rangers. The rangers are in a sister division, and they have a slightly different function, working with wildfire and some other law enforcement issues. So we work with them, but we are not forest rangers. So one of the primary questions you need to, as a landowner or as a logger, as a forester, you're trying to answer from the outset when you're planning or contemplating a timber harvest is, what are your harvest goals? And you want to think about those fairly carefully. Most landowners will have multiple goals. Obviously, much of the time there's an immediate sort of financial consideration. We think about cutting trees, cutting wood to generate income from the sale of the wood. And cutting trees, having equipment involves cost. I mean, someone is paid for that work, unless you're doing it yourself as a landowner. There may be equipment involved, whether it's your own equipment or someone else's. So we're always trying to make sure that the value of the wood is going to exceed the cost, unless there's some other reason for doing it. And then obviously there are places where, you know, you might be harvesting trees for your own use. At the same time, much of what we do in forestry is to try to think about the future as well as what's happening at any one moment. And so when you're harvesting, can you protect or in fact improve the forest for the future? Are there opportunities to increase its future growth or the value that may grow there, depending on the trees, the types of trees, the quality of those trees, regenerating the forest for the future, and sort of having in mind the question of when can you return for further harvesting? Is it going to be just a few years? Is it going to be a longer time frame? And how do you plan for that in whatever you're contemplating for the immediate future? And most people, as I said, have multiple goals, and oftentimes they're trying to protect other resources or balance different aspects of that activity with their recreation needs, their sense of aesthetics, the wildlife habitats that they enjoy and value, and also some of the other resources, the soil qualities, the streams, other water bodies, and so forth. So having a good sense of what your goals are is a really key step. We really recommend that people plan for their entire woodlot and for the future. So planning, we're talking here primarily about planning just for a single harvest event, but really the context is, what are you doing on your woodlot? Hopefully you're going to own it for many years and get enjoyment from it for a long time. So the big picture is knowing what you've got, what's growing in your forest, what's its potential, what benefits does it have, what some of your different options are, and developing an action plan that's kind of has a somewhat longer time frame, 10 years plus. And oftentimes that's going to be done with the help of a licensed forester. But the questions you might ask yourself and try to answer in that comprehensive planning is, you know, does it make sense to harvest now? Is there perhaps a rationale for putting off a harvest based on how the forest is growing? Do you want to harvest just a portion of the property? Do you want to break up a harvest over multiple years? How might this happen? What other projects might you undertake? That whole aspect of sort of long-range planning is something that you might capture in a forest management plan, again, that a licensed forester helps you with or prepares for you. And we'll do a whole nother presentation on forest management plans and sort of thinking long term. We're often, or I'm often reminded about the fact that the land has, you know, the land's been there for a while, and everything that we're doing at any given moment in time is predicated on what's happened there in the past. So, you know, oftentimes understanding what's happened in the past is an important starting point for planning a particular harvest, and also understanding that what you're doing in any harvest is really putting your mark on the land for the future. Trees live a long time, forests have changed. You know, you're basically putting your mark of stewardship on the land for the future. So to get down into the sort of the nitty-gritty of planning a harvest, there is a long list of questions that you might want to ask yourself, and be sure that they're addressed. These are kind of key elements. There are certainly other aspects that you could consider, but these are some of the key elements. We might just sort of big picture, who's involved, who's making decisions, and what decisions are there to be made, who's responsible for different aspects of the harvest, where is the harvest, and what kinds of laws and regulations might apply. So really just setting the stage and being sure that you understand who's involved, who is making decisions, how is this going to occur, and where is it going to occur. The simplest way of thinking about this is just to know who is going to be on your land doing what, and where is the boundary, literally the boundary of your property, so that you make sure that you're doing work on your land and not infringing on neighbors. A second kind of key set of questions revolves around which trees are you actually going to harvest. Lots of different techniques for harvesting, lots of different approaches, depending on the conditions in your woods. And we'll talk a little bit more about this dimension, but understanding which trees actually are part of the harvest, or that will actually be cut. Planning for those and having a good understanding of what the intention is helps you understand what the result will be. Obviously, another aspect is when trees are cut, what kind of products will they be used for? What are the different places where those products will be sold? And what are fair prices? You as a landowner want to obviously enjoy the income from the harvest. There are other costs involved. So what's fair? What is a reasonable way to appreciate the income versus the costs of having the work done? And when can you expect to be paid? If you are the landowner, how are you going to get paid, and when are you going to get paid for the wood that is being cut? Again, this is something that can be answered in a bunch of different ways, but planning ahead and having an understanding of that is important. Then there's sort of operational aspects of the harvest. What kinds of equipment are going to be used? There is a pretty wide array of available equipment, and we'll look at some examples. But depending on how the harvest is supposed to be done and what trees are being cut, what products are being cut, might suggest different kinds of equipment to get different kinds of results. And in order for that equipment to do the work, you have to access the harvest area. And in simplest terms, that means trails, roads, and log landings. Trails to move the wood from where the trees are cut to where a truck can reach them at a log landing, and possibly some kind of road on your property if it is a large enough piece that a truck road is required. So different types of access for different styles and sizes of harvesting. Those are important sort of infrastructure that may already exist, and you want to make sure not only that it's in place for the immediate harvest, but also that it's there for the future. And a whole range of other questions about how the operation is going to address slash, water quality issues, soil conditions, and let's just be honest, harvesting is by its nature, it's a destructive activity. It's for the right reasons, but there will be some damage, and how much is allowable, acceptable, How will damaged trees be addressed? And of course, are there any special features about your property that you want to be sure that the operators are aware of? And then to sort of wrap this all together, planning ahead just implies that you have an understanding of when the harvest is going to occur. If it's, a harvest that is going to start in a couple of weeks, has some real questions about it, and harvesting that might take place in the winter once frozen conditions exist. Those are two pretty different time frames. Or in fact, maybe it's something that will have to be put off until next summer, something like that. And along with that sort of wrapping the whole thing together, the question of when you plan a harvest, are you going to put that plan itself into writing in a more detailed harvest plan? And are you going to put the agreement that you make with whoever is doing the work, if you're not doing it yourself, are you going to put that agreement in writing? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but certainly most of the time we recommend that you really do put everything into written form. I want to say just a little bit more about different types of harvests, and this is just a really brief snapshot of much longer discussion. But when we think about harvesting a forest, we might think about it in terms of thinning the forest. So we're cutting some trees to give other trees more room to grow. And so we're improving growth rates. And while we're doing that, we can favor particular types of trees over others. And we can also favor better quality trees. And those might be quality from a timber standpoint, which trees are going to develop the best value as higher value saw logs. Or we might think in terms of, well, which trees are going to provide wildlife habitat, or just aesthetic value. So we can certainly think about the thinning project in terms of all the different goals that we might have for a harvest. Alternatively, we might be thinking about a regeneration harvest, but there again, we might regenerate smaller areas. So to regenerate trees, we're essentially going to create space at the forest floor so that seedlings or sprouts can develop. But that can happen in smaller openings, which might, in fact, not look all that much different from a thinning. We might create some somewhat larger openings to get different types of seedlings or sprouts to grow, or to encourage different species of trees. Clear cutting at a somewhat larger scale is another technique that has certain pluses and certainly minuses, but pluses in terms of the wildlife habitats it might create, or of tree species that might regenerate from that cut. So different words mean different things, and so a lot of times people will say, I just want a selective cut, and that's not, it kind of is intuitive, but you want to be very careful and make sure that people mean the same things when they're using the same words. Selective can imply a whole range of different things, and what you want to be clear on is, who's selecting the trees for what reasons. What you might want to consider as a landowner is to avoid high grading, which essentially means that you're taking the best trees and leaving some poor value trees. And if you do that, then essentially you're limiting or severely reducing the potential of the forest to grow in the future. So be sure to have a clear understanding of which trees are being cut and what is the result that you're looking for your forest and for its future. I'll just give you a moment to read that. We're not, we certainly don't suggest that landowners should cut in a particular way at a particular time, you as the landowner have a lot of options, and you can decide what you want to have happen on your property, whether it's kind of at the hands-off end of the scale or a more active approach. And again, I just want to emphasize that you don't really have to go to either end of that spectrum. There's a whole range of different options in between. These images are all different areas that have been harvested in a short time frame in the few years prior to the picture being taken. So in the upper left, that was a regeneration harvest that involved leaving some trees and creating a whole lot of space for a really nice stand of young trees to grow in underneath. On the lower left, that's a thinning harvest in a white pine stand, really nicely thinned, and the trees that are left there are going to grow really well and grow value into the future. On the right-hand side, you might not see it, but that harvest was that stand was harvested just in the year or two prior to the photo being taken. It was a landowner who had a high interest in wildlife. The harvest was quite light. It did remove some valuable trees, but it also left a lot of wildlife habitat elements, including some dead and down trees, some cavity trees, some low forest cover. So, as I said, the range of options is really broad. One of the resources we have is this book, What Will My Woods Look Like? That Andy was heavily involved in putting that together, and it's a great resource for people to look at a whole number of different styles of harvesting and ways of approaching a timber harvest and what the results will actually look like. That's really the most common question that we get is, well, what's it going to look like afterward? So this is a great resource. You can certainly get a copy of this from your district forester, and if you have an interest in having them come out to your property and take a walk with you and give you some suggestions, they can most often bring a copy of this with them. And another aspect or another way to approach this is to think about, as there are workshops and field tours, it's really helpful to think about this and also see what other people have done. So great number of resources and field tours and workshops that are going on from Maine Forest Service and other organizations that you can tap into.
Morten, can I just jump in for a second on that?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah. The intent of that book was to start conversations before work starts. Not only envisioning how things are going to look, but what are the outcomes, the desired outcomes of the harvest. And the book hopefully will work as that tool between a landowner and a logger, landowner and a forester and a logger, or all of the above. That conversation ahead of time will go a long way to considering all these things that Morten's been talking about and will continue to talk about. We've done our best to get those books out in the hands of not only our district foresters, but consulting foresters and loggers. So you can get it online, you can get a PDF version, or you can check with your district forester, or perhaps the logger or forester you're working with already has it as well. So encourage you to look for that. Okay.
Great. So just a note on terminology. There are, again, a lot of terms that get tossed around, and when you're talking about harvest planning, and sometimes people will say harvest administration, it's just a matter of planning ahead and managing, making decisions about different aspects of what's going to happen. Sort of it's kind of a project management approach. You want to think about your harvest as a project, and you have to plan for it and make decisions about it all along the way. Timber harvest sometimes gets referred to as a timber sale or a logging job or a logging operation or a timber cut, pretty much all refers to the same thing. We sometimes use the phrase a commercial harvest, which basically means that it's a timber harvest where the wood is sold. It's actually generating value, the landowner's selling their trees. A few landowners will do their own cutting, certainly, but most will involve a professional logger. And they are actually selling wood, the landowners selling their wood either directly to the logging contractor or a procurement forester or some other entity. So we use that phrase commercial harvest to distinguish from, what we'd call a pre-commercial operation, which is, someone is doing some thinning to improve the future growth, but it's mostly small trees and there's not enough value there to really make it worthwhile to sell wood. So most of the time when we're talking about timber harvesting, we're talking about a commercial harvest. Landowners often are encouraged to do some kinds of thinning on their own if they can, just with hand tools or with a chainsaw and so forth. So there's, again, a pretty broad spectrum of activities that can go on. When we talk about timber sales, number of different ways to set that up. Again, this is a kind of a presentation unto itself, but people aren't always familiar with the term stumpage and what it means to have a timber sale that's set up as a stumpage sale. We sometimes call it a pay-as-cut sale. Essentially what that means is that the landowner is selling their trees on the stump. They've ideally agreed on a set of prices ahead of time, or stumpage prices. Oftentimes it's a logger or some other type of buyer who's essentially buying the trees on the stump, and then the logger goes and harvests those trees, and the wood gets sold or marketed to the different entities that will buy wood, either some kind of wood buyer, a concentration yard, or a mill. And from the wood that is trucked away from that site, every truckload gets measured in some fashion, either as saw logs in thousands of board feet, or as other products in cords or tons or 1,000 pounds. And when that wood is received by a mill, it generates a scale slip or a mill slip that shows the volume and the quality of each load, and the payment to the landowner is made based on that volume and the price that's agreed. So this is really, in many ways, a common way of landowners selling their timber. There are other ways. You can sell it as a lump sum. You can sell it roadside. There are different ways to set up service contracts, but stumpage is really sort of the most common. Maine Forest Service publishes average stumpage prices, and that's available on our website as well, so people can get an idea. Prices will fluctuate over time, but you can look up, what prices have been in the past to sort of give you a ballpark idea of what certain different species and different products might be sold for as stumpage. There are a whole number of other steps in preparing a harvest, and a lot of these sort of involve, doing some work in the field, in the woods, to identify things ahead of time. Things like flagging the boundaries or the limits to harvest area, determining what trees will be cut, sort of what we call silviculture. And in some cases, marking those trees or some of the trees to be cut, or in different scenarios, some of the trees to be retained. Planning out roads, log landings, trails, sometimes using plastic ribbon or flagging to identify where those will be constructed or used. We use this term best management practices to talk about different erosion control and prevention techniques to make sure that, especially at stream crossings, but anytime you're working around water bodies, to make sure that we're not having an impact on those water bodies, that they're well protected, that we're not generating sediment that's going to end up in those water bodies. And then in preparation, there are just a very basic forest operations notification that needs to be filed by the landowner, or in some cases with the help of their forester or their logger. You definitely want to look ahead of time to see what kind of legal requirements might be specific to your property. And in fact, if in some cases there might be permits required. Just a really quick overview of legal considerations, and this is certainly things that we could talk about at greater length, but it is legally required that you mark the boundaries of your property anytime when you're harvesting within 200 feet of those boundaries. The Forest Practices Act has that notification and subsequent landowner report requirement. It also contains some requirements concerning clear cutting and regeneration. There's a liquidation harvesting law that involves land which is being bought, cut, and sold within a 5-year time period. That has some specific requirements associated with it. And then there are a range of natural resources laws, again, that deal primarily with water quality and operating around water bodies, as well as a few other considerations relating to wildlife habitat or slash. It's important to make sure that you look also at whatever local ordinances there might be. Some towns have specific requirements or conditions or restrictions on timber harvesting, so that has to be specific to the town you're working in. And then in some cases, harvesting might be constrained or have other limitations placed on it by any types of easements that might be on your property or portions of the property, and how, if your property is enrolled in the tree growth tax law, what sorts of plans you've put in place to comply with tree growth requirements. Tree growth is a topic that we addressed at our last meeting, and so there's a whole nother presentation to be had around tree growth issues. Harvest preparation basically also might involve putting together the actual agreement that says, okay, we're going to harvest roughly this amount of volume and value, just to get a sense of, how much value can you expect. Determining what, given the type of harvest that you have, what kind of equipment might be best suited to the work that's supposed to happen, identifying and researching who might be an appropriate logger to do that work, determining what fair prices might be and negotiating those prices, and then putting that into a written form as a timber harvester sale contract to make sure that everybody has those same expectations and responsibilities. You're not quite done yet because you still have to plan for harvest supervision. How is oversight of the harvest going to happen? Who's going to review the harvest periodically? There will be changing conditions with the best of planning. How are you going to address problem solving, and who will make those decisions? Sort of an ongoing review of how the wood is being marketed, make sure that it's going for its maximum value, reviewing the scale slips and payments that are coming in, and at the end of the job, making sure that things are completed and closed out, especially in terms of roads or trails, stream crossings, and so forth, before the equipment leaves the site. And in the somewhat longer term, making sure that you capture the sort of the summary of what's been cut for later reporting and or tax purposes. So who might you involve in all this work? We've just covered a whole range of decisions and topic areas. And what we really recommend is, if you are not familiar with harvesting in considerable detail, most landowners will recommend that you have a forester involved with the harvest to help you with that planning process and and making decisions so that you have a clear expectation of what's going to happen, and also following through with helping you with supervision. Certainly when you involve a logger, and as I said, most harvests will involve a logger that you work with, they will be doing some of that process as well. They're the ones who are going to be on the spot felling and yarding trees, and if there's road work or maintaining or dealing with trails, log landings and stream crossings, that's the work that the logger themselves is going to do. Marketing, trucking the wood is often something that the logger will arrange. In some cases, that's the forester's responsibility. At the end of the job, are there other considerations? Is there cleanup remaining to be done? If you're planning ahead, you want to plan for things, sort of things out of the blue, like firewood that you might want to keep from your harvest. It's not really fair to a logger to, the day before that they're getting ready to leave, to say, oh, by the way, can you leave me a few cords of firewood? Much better to have that understood and planned for and communicated up front. So again, many landowners don't really know the value of their trees. They might not be sure how the forest is going to grow in the future, how different types of operations will affect what happens in the future. And so the message here is really that we recommend that you have a forester involved in the harvest to help you make those decisions, everything from the individual trees to be cut, as in the case of this forester who has a paint gun, he's marking trees to be harvested, to the remaining aspect, how to identify a skilled logger who's got the right equipment and will do a good job for you. So in this, for a lot of landowners, we're recommending that you have a forester involved to make sure that things go well. There's a lot to be said for planning ahead. It's not just emergencies, but just to make sure that everything gets communicated ahead of time. This is a particularly responsible logger who's put up an emergency action plan, with lat-long coordinates for the site and contact information for a whole range of different folks. This is a really good thing to do, but of course it's something that needs to be planned for. Not just the emergencies, but everything that's going to happen needs to be planned for. We sometimes talk about the sort of the forest harvesting triangle. Three folks involved gives you three different perspectives on the job, and certainly you as the landowner are the one making the ultimate decisions. But you should be getting input from your forester and getting their help and communicating with and working with the logger. Most landowners with a small, couple 100-acre or smaller woodlot will only have a few significant harvests during the time they own the property. So you can't put the trees back. You want to make sure that you get it right. And a big aspect of that is planning ahead. A big aspect of planning ahead is communications. I'm going to start moving a little bit more quickly. I realize I'm going kind of slower than I had expected. So I'm just going to mention in passing and again say that these aspects all involve a much more in-depth kind of set of information and could each be a presentation in and of themselves. So we'll just look at forest operations. The trees have to be felled, they have to be yarded. That involves trails. There have to be log landings for the wood to get accumulated. There might be roads, and stream crossings are a particular sensitive area. It's important to know what kind of equipment might be best suited to the type of harvest. It's also really important to know what's the operator's level of skill and care that they're going to take on the property. There are, many highly skilled loggers out there, so Make sure that you end up working with someone who's going to do the job and can produce the results that you want. So in terms of equipment, yeah, there's a large range, everything from the small tractors to much bigger equipment, different types of skidders, different types of felling equipment, well beyond the chainsaw. So understand what those are and how they're going to impact your project and the results that you get. The log landing can take all kinds of different forms. It might be a field. It might be a small area cleared in the woods. How much space is needed by that particular job, and what will that area look like when it's done? If more space is needed, certainly different ways to, and certainly sometimes a lot of space is needed in the log landing, but what kind of condition is that going to be left in? Trails. Trails can take all kinds of different forms. Each of these is a different trail with a different level of impact. Depends on the equipment and depends on the season of the harvest and how careful the operator is and so forth. So what do those trails look like? Are you going to be able to reuse them in the future? Certainly, people use different techniques to avoid impact to the soil. That's a really important aspect. Like brush and slash and limbs. At other times, those impacts could have perhaps been on the right-hand slide. Those impacts could certainly have been avoided. Truck roads. Do you need to build a truck road? To what standard does it need to be built? Are there existing roads that can be used? In some cases, are there existing roads that could be really problematic, such as the slide on the right here that shows, an old public road actually that's got a lot of problems and potential for erosion. Capturing all of that again in some form of harvest plan might be as simple as, okay, we'll sketch this out and look at the different areas of the operation. Knowing that ahead of time and communicating is really important. Another form of communication, of course, is that written contract. You might have a contract if you have hired a forester for your job. You might have a contract that just says these are the services that he or she will provide in terms of planning and supervision and administration. You'll probably also want to have a timber sale contract directly with the logger or whoever the buyer is to identify, which trees you're selling and what the prices are and what the conditions of those might be. So again, a timber sale contract is between you, the landowner as a seller, and whoever the purchaser is, the buyer. In many cases, it's ideal if you have your own forester, if they prepare that contract, or at least have somebody sufficiently knowledgeable who kind of understands all of this and can put it in a place where it's representing and protecting your interests as the landowner. A little bit more on why have a contract. Contract really serves all parties. It's a communications tool. It's to make sure that you have common expectations. Basically, you're putting it in writing, which is a whole lot easier to remember than, hey, remember we talked about, whatever the topic is. And it also just kind of gives you a checklist to make sure that things are agreed to in advance. And ideally, the contract, in a way, describes what the results are, who's doing what, and becomes an expression of the plan that you've put together. So I'll just conclude. The take-home points really are that planning ahead makes a huge difference. There are people who plan a few weeks in advance, but certainly it's never too early to start planning and understanding what the potential of the property is. Part of that is just getting more information. If you're not sure if you're ready to harvest, get to know more about forestry through some of those other means that we talked about. Maine Forest Service certainly recommends that you hire a reputable, knowledgeable, licensed forester to help you. And we certainly also recommend that you work with a reputable, skilled professional logger. And there are, many good loggers out there that you can work with. It's really all about communication and making sure everybody involved is all on the same page. And oftentimes on the same page means literally, with a harvest plan, and certainly with a written contract that says what's expected and who's doing what. And if this is at all helpful for you, but you have more questions than we can answer today, certainly we really recommend that you go out to some field tours or demonstration forests or some harvest sites that you're aware of, and ask questions. Try to understand what's happening there. Always, we recommend that you talk with several foresters, and if you're considering hiring someone, get references. The same is true of loggers. Talk to several loggers, and make sure you get references. Certainly any amount of reading material out there, books, magazines, our newsletter, the different organizations that have information, and importantly, think about your goals and talk to, if you have other family members involved, make sure that you talk with them and understand how they view things. So I'll stop there and see if there are any other questions. Certainly, again, after today's presentation and Q&A, make sure, feel free to contact any of us at the Maine Forest Service if you have questions or if you would like a site visit from one of our district foresters.
All right. Great. Thank you, Morten. So as you mentioned, now would be a good time to either type questions in the chat, or I do want to point out that we have placed a couple of links in the chat already. One is for that What Will My Woods Look Like booklet, so you can see that online or download a PDF version. Another is for the most recent stumpage price reports. Just a little caveat there, it takes a while to compile that information, so I believe the most recent one that's up is the 2019, but I could be wrong. It could be 2018.
I think it's 2018, and the 2019 is generally out sort of toward the end of the year in the following year.
Yeah. So while that may not give you the most up-to-the-minute results, it's a good benchmark. It gives you an idea of a range because we put in there the high, the low, and the average for different species products. It's also a good way to, if you're not familiar with all the different species products, pine saw logs, hardwood chips, et cetera, it kind of is a good educational tool that way. So not seeing any other questions in the chat. Does anybody just want to jump in? Chuck Davis, I think it looks like you've been trying. You want to just unmute and ask your question?
Not really. The program's been really pretty good.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
My 120 acres in Maine, in Farmington, Pete Tracy is my forester, and I'd certainly recommend anybody doing anything with the woodlot contact with a forester. Pete's been really good with me.
Great, that's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's what we mean by references. When you get a referral or a reference from another landowner who's worked with a forester or a logger, that's good information. Because they're reacting to what's actually happened. There was a question about the resource for the timber prices. It's in the chat. It's also online. It's called the Stumpage Price Report. And if that doesn't quite work for you, it looks like Jay Tall, you asked that question. We can figure out, I'll put my contact information in there too. You can always call me or email me, and I can connect you to stuff that's either online or other places. And we've also put in there a link to a survey that we encourage folks to take to help us improve these WoodsWise lunch hours. But before we sign off, we did have some questions sent in ahead of time, and I think I'll take this opportunity to read them now. one landowner sent in actually three-part question. The first one is, I live out of state. I own family woodlots in Maine. I'm planning a harvest. I have a full woodlot management plan prepared by a licensed forester. Some of the parcels are in tree growth, others not. My question is, is the harvest income derived from harvesting on tree growth lots and non-tree growth lots treated the same or differently for taxes? So I'll give you the short answer. No, it's not treated differently. It's treated the same. Mort, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd certainly suggest is that the forester who prepared their forest management plan is probably their best resource for planning an actual harvest. Undoubtedly, the forest management plan talks about when harvesting might be appropriate and where and so forth. So the next step really for the landowner is to contact the forester again and say, yep, we read the plan, looked at it, want to start implementing some of this. Let's start planning a timber harvest. And that question about the income, is something that certainly their forester is going to be able to answer, and many other questions, including the whole range of planning steps that we talked about.
Okay, great. Part two of that question, should I have a Maine CPA prepare the tax income papers for the harvest and forward to my out-of-state tax CPA, or attempt to have my home state tax person address the topic? My thought on that is it's really up to you, whatever you're comfortable with. My suggestion is that whoever you work with, that they are knowledgeable about timber tax treatments, both the federal and in the state where it's being harvested. Not every CPA handles a lot of timber sales, or tax advisor, so you may want to shop for one who is familiar with it. Also, there is a resource, a federal tax site called the Timber Tax site, which is www.timbertax.org, and we can probably get that in the chat as well, which is really good for that federal IRS treatment. We also do know that there is at least one person, a forester in the state of Maine, who kind of specializes in that because he is retired from the IRS, and I think we can probably mention his name without danger of showing preferential treatment. His name is Jim Norris. He lives in Winthrop, and if anybody wanted to contact him, we can connect you.
I would just add again that this is probably something that this landowner's forester has actually dealt with before, so that wouldn't be a bad place to start, to just ask them about the tax implications from their end of things, and they might have additional suggestions or comments or ways that they handle some of the things that you might need.
Yep. The other item is that most generally, timber income is not regular income. It gets a different treatment, but the details of that can be very specific. So that's why it's good to talk, do some research and talk with a tax advisor or a CPA who's familiar with timber sales. The third part of the question, some of my woodlots are accessible from a town road, but other sections are more easily and less impactful to access via neighbor's land. Do I have to acquire any additional insurance rider or liabilities or such, even though I carry liability on my land and buildings? So as I understand the question, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. I think it depends a lot on what that neighbor is going to ask you for or require in order to give permission to cross. So that's part of that discussion. Keep in mind that pretty much all logging contractors are maintaining fairly high levels of liability, general liability, professional liability, vehicle liability, which in many cases would cover the situations that would arise from crossing somebody's land. But again, it's going to depend on the situation. So again, my favorite answer to a lot of questions is it depends, and I think that's what fits here.
I would say my favorite answer right now is, I would be willing to bet that this is something that your forester has dealt with before and would be a good person as you're planning your timber harvest to ask them. But it is, pretty common, if not actually universal, that the logging contractors will have liability insurance that will also protect the landowner.
Okay, any other questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat. Anybody else want to unmute and chime in?
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Chuck.
Good morning again. I would emphasize that good relationships with butters is terribly, terribly important. I have a really good beer drinking relationship with somebody bordering my land, and we were able to do a line cut. Pete helped us with it. That he got one big one, I got one big one, he got one big one, and it's marked and went very easily, and everybody had a beer at the end. Terrible.
Okay, it does
Sounds
sound
like a good outcome.
Yeah,
well
exactly.
Well
I do
planned
want to.
outcome.
You do bring up a point about cutting line trees, and without permission of both landowners, it's not legal to cut a line tree. So in this case, it looked like both landowners got along well on that. I would also strongly suggest that line trees, in many cases, are more valuable standing there as a line tree with a marker on them for the future. However, I also understand that sometimes you get some pretty valuable trees that are on the line, and you may not want to give up all the value there. As long as there's other trees to help mark the line, you're probably okay.
You'll also want to be aware, and there's a comment here, but if a line tree is actually part of the boundary evidence, you really don't want to disturb existing boundary evidence, just for practical reasons as well as legally. Anything that is part of the physical line, you probably want to leave intact.
And that was brought forth by a surveyor's perspective. So if you're working with a surveyor, you may want to consult with them about, before you think about cutting line trees. Okay, well, we're getting very close to 1 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I think that it looks like most folks stuck around. We really appreciate it. We do plan to do more of these in the future. As part of that survey, we asked you to suggest topics or sort of vote on general topic areas so that we know, where the interests lie. Timber harvesting was something that folks from the previous one, a lot of them had checked that box and said that was a topic of interest. So that's why we chose that for this episode of the WoodsWise Lunch Hour. And keep your eyes out on the various announcement email listservs. We have our WoodsWise Wire. Probably some of you folks learned about this from the Maine woodland owners or from the Maine Forest Products Council or perhaps from other organizations, and that's great. We'll usually get the word out a couple weeks in advance and then a reminder the week of. So
we should probably just acknowledge that some people probably have to leave right at 1. So if you do, feel free to sign off, and I'm happy to stay around. I'm sure Andy is as well for additional questions.
Yes, and there is another one in the chat. The question is, what kind of insurances should foresters carry, and does it matter whether they are the consultant or procurement forester as far as liability? I would say that a lot of foresters do carry a sort of professional or contractor's liability, and that's a good thing. whether it matters whether the consultant or procurement forester. I would say if they're actually buying and selling, that there could be greater liability in that, but it's going to be very specific to the situation. Morten, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is where it's really important, and this part of a longer discussion, but it's really important to understand in what capacity the forester is functioning. Are they functioning as an advisor exclusively to you, or are they a procurement forester? Is essentially a forester who works for a mill or a wood buyer and is in the business of working on properties that they're where they want to buy the trees. So both roles can be important, can be useful to a landowner, but if in terms of liability insurance, I think in either case you'd want to have them have a professional liability insurance. But the agreement that you have with either the independent consultant or the procurement forester should state whether they are acting on behalf of you as a consultant to you as an independent consultant, or whether they're acting on behalf of a mill. And in either case, as I said, they can be a really valuable resource. But you'd want to have that clarified in whatever agreement you have with the forester. In Maine, under Maine licensing rules, a licensed forester should disclose to you if they have a conflict of interest, and you should understand where they're coming from, and how they are providing services and on whose behalf, basically, who's paying them. Longer discussion, but it's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think mentioning that whatever types of insurance or levels of liability are being required really should be included in whatever the agreement is between the parties. Again, applies both to consultants that are advising the landowner and procurement foresters who are just essentially the wood buyer.
Yeah. Keep in mind, just not to confuse the issue, but keep in mind that there is there's potentially two contracts that a landowner might have. One is the agreement they have with their forester that says they are providing a certain set of services, and they're going to be compensated by the landowner in some particular form. And then the other contract is the actual harvest contract that says these are the conditions under which trees are going to be cut and who's buying them. So you might actually have two contracts, and one is with your forester and the other is with whoever is buying the trees. Again, we could have a longer discussion, but that's an important consideration.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. I don't know, Chuck, were you looking to say something else, or? Okay. Well, folks, I think we'll call it the lunch hour plus 3 minutes. And thank you again. Hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
So long.
Well done.
Thank you.